On this week's episode of the Speak Life podcast, I have Thomas Winborn. Thomas is a church planter in Texas, who I've had the privilege of ministering alongside in the past. I've consulted with him on counseling issues. He's just a great man of God, and I'm excited for what he gets to share with you today. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Speak Life podcast. This week I have Thomas Winborn with me. He's pastor at a newly formed church plant. It's Lake City.
Yeah, Lake City Church.
Yeah, Lake City Church. And so I'm excited to be able to talk through issues pastors face with you, because really you bring a unique voice into things from what we've had so far. You're not only going to be able to speak into challenges with pastoring, but having been in church planning, even being able to think from that lens a little bit too, and just how that applies. So Thomas, why don't you take a moment and just kind of introduce yourself, talk about yourself, your family, your ministry history.
Yeah, so I am married to my wife, Carol, who is my human hero in this world. And she has, with me, we've had 6 children. And the oldest is currently 11, about to turn 12. The youngest is 2 years old. So we live in chaos and we love it. We have been married for about 14 years. In that, I have been a full-time youth and college pastor, a full-time lead pastor for a church revitalization in Maryland, where Bill and I worked around each other. I was there for about 9 years, and then revitalization work in North Alabama for 4 years, and now planting a church, which is something I've wanted to do since seminary, but God never greenlighted it until now. Throughout that process, I also coached and trained church planters and revitalization pastors. Did that a lot in Maryland as I worked closely with the state convention. Yeah, man. And for fun, I like to hunt, shoot things, shoot steel, ride motorcycles, anything, bow fishing, anything adventurous.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just for the record, I don't know that we've ever talked a whole lot, at least recently, about how we met, but I remember being in Maryland in the mall of all places, JCPenney. I think it was, I don't remember if it was you. I think it was your wife had walked by when Julie and I were in there and saw a Southwestern Seminary sweatshirt. And it took us a second to realize, wait a minute, we're in Maryland. We don't normally see a Southwestern Seminary sweatshirt. And so started a conversation, realized we'd been there at the same time and had some mutual friends, and then just got to connect from there. So one of those fun, it's a small world kinds of things. God ordained appointment in the middle of JCPenney.
Yeah, in the middle of the mountains in Maryland.
Yeah, Western Maryland. So I'll tell you what, with that being said, part of the point, really the main point of the podcast, is to be able to talk through what are the challenges that pastors tend to face and what are potential solutions to those challenges. And so in your history and ministry, whether we're talking about an established church or a church revitalization project or a church plant, how would you talk through challenges you faced in ministry? What are the top 2 or 3 that come to mind?
Yeah, so I think the most all-encompassing issues that I've experienced in ministry have been based around leadership within the church. I think that, 2 things: leadership within the church when it comes to people, and then I think a lack of gospel or Jesus-centeredness theologically. Those 2 things have been the biggest issues that I think that I've had to deal with as a pastor, as a coach, just as a member of a church. So the human side is a little different than the theological perspective there, but I think that one feeds into the other. So I'd say the biggest one probably is the Jesus-centered perspective. I know it's a hot button topic amongst theologians about a gospel-centered or Jesus-centered hermeneutic, Right. But I tend to lean into like John 5:39, that where Jesus talking to the Pharisees, and he says, you look for eternal life in the scriptures, you miss the point, they're all about me. On the road to Emmaus, he points out all the things in the Old Testament that point to him as he's walking with those guys to bring them to illumination at that moment. And so I think you can take it too far and get into heavy allegorization of Old Testament passages where Jesus is behind every bush, You can also go the other way where Satan's behind every bush as well. And kind of alleviate yourself of responsibility of sin. But at the end of the day, I see that Jesus and the cross is the apex of human history. And everything in the Old Testament points to the need for that, and everything in the New Testament points back to that. And so, reading the scriptures in a way that you see that if you're preaching and teaching that Jesus is the hero every week, if we're not doing that, we lead people to put faith in either their abilities or in their own, like put faith in their amount of faith.
Yeah.
Um, or we lead them to a point of despair because they can't ever get where they think they need to be, instead of running to Jesus and seeing that
Yeah.
Jesus has done everything necessary to bring us into good relationship with God. So that's number one. And that goes down to everything, man, from like little kids up to older folks that have been in church forever, which leads us on to the mission as well, right? That
Right.
because of that, we don't see Jesus as the center. We think getting everybody in is the goal. But Jesus' 3 years of ministry was making disciples. And his whole time on the earth in ministry before he left, the center of that was making disciples and preaching the gospel. And so those need to be the central pieces of what we do as people that are emulating that as, Christians like Jesus. So,
Yeah. So as I think through that, I think through the idea of a Jesus-centered hermeneutic and how that plays into challenges that pastors face. How do you see that tying into the other thing you mentioned? How do you see that tying into leadership struggles, leadership challenges
yeah.
in a church setting?
So every time I've gone to a new place, to a new assignment, I would say from the Lord, the first thing that I do is try to get connected with everybody that's seen as a leader, even if they don't have a leadership position. I try to sit down, do dinner, get in their home. I want to get in their comfort environment. And at first, I want to see if the conversations go to Jesus on their own. If not, I'll try to prod them that way, because to me, the biggest thing I look for in somebody as a potential leader is if I cut them, will they bleed Jesus? Like that's kind of graphic. That's the way I
Yeah.
see it, to say it. So does Jesus roll off their lips? Because anybody that's been in church long enough can wax eloquently in front of a deacon body or an elder board and pray like that they're religious,
Yeah.
and use Jesus all over that. But is Jesus like just coming out of them because they are sitting with Jesus, like sitting in the presence of God on a regular basis, in the Word, in prayer, like to be with Him, right? And
Yeah.
so that to me is the number one characteristic I look for in leaders, is that Jesus just rolls off their lips because they're spending time with Him, and they're rejoicing in Him, they're repenting to Him, they're celebrating Him, and they're
Yeah.
experiencing Him. If I don't see that, I'm not going to want you to be a leader.
So as I hear you talking about that, the big part of what I'm thinking through is I'm thinking about how leadership becomes a challenge in a church. And there's really two sides to this. There's way more than two sides to this. The two sides that I'm thinking of are whether it's a leader that you get to pick or a leader that you inherit, right? So if you're depending on the setting that you're coming into. And so when you're talking about this assessment of character, which 100% makes sense to me, the idea of thinking through what are you seeing in this individual? To what extent are they living it out in ways that not just when everybody's paying attention, but when nobody's paying attention? It
Yeah.
reminds me of to name somebody and talk about integrity issues. Bill Hybels wrote a book back in the 80s. I think 86, 87. Who You Are When No One's Looking. It's dated because it talks about Mike Singletary when he was playing for the Bears.
Right.
So this book's been around for a little while.
My favorite guy in Tecmo Bowl, by the way, back in the day.
Techno Bowl. I completely forgot that existed until you just brought it up.
You're
So yeah, thinking about the idea of who you are when nobody's looking, there's integrity there. There's congruence there that no matter what's going on, there's solidarity in somebody's character and the way that they approach Jesus, talk about Jesus, come back to Jesus when they're struggling, all of that kind of stuff. And it's kind of within that recognizing that they aren't Jesus, right? That
right.
they need to continue to turn back to him to be who he's calling them to be. So there's an extent to which that's all well and good to think of in terms of when you're getting to appoint leaders.
Right.
How do you deal with it from your perspective when it's a leader you've inherited and you're recognizing, I don't think this person needs to continue to be a leader?
Yeah.
And I'm going to add one thing to that, a recognition, and this is what was on the last episode of the podcast. We talked a lot about formal leadership structures and informal leadership structures. So it's one thing when we're talking about the chairman of the board of deacons, or other deacons or other elders in the church. It's something different when it's somebody else in the church who maybe doesn't have an official leadership position, but they're a highly respected individual in the church who also maybe gives a lot of the money.
Yeah.
So how do you conceptualize that when it's an inherited leader, whether formal or informal?
Yeah, and I think figuring that out is hard. Just if you step into a scene, right? If you step into a new
Right.
place, it's hard to figure that out. So I always ask other leaders, like, who do you think is the biggest top 10 or 20 families of influence? Like asking those questions. And then I compile all
Yeah.
that in my head or in my notes and kind of rank those out. Because those people will surface to the top, right? I think it's hard. I think that you had to try to discern first of all who that is. I like to bring my wife along for those initial introductions because she's very
Yeah.
discerning, and so
Okay.
she sees through things way faster than I do. Often, I've learned from her some of those things of how to do that. I'm able to pick up on cues better, but she's oftentimes we'll leave somewhere. I'll be like, "Man, that was a good meet," and she'll be like, "Man, there's something off there,"
Yeah.
And I have yet to see her be wrong in that. I often say it and half kind of joking, but really I'm not. I think her walk with the Lord has been going on for so much longer than mine that she just has a tighter listening for that spirit, to
Mm.
maneuver a little bit or nudge her. Um, and I think that's one of the things too, is leaning into the spirit on this. Every situation is different. So we need to be making ourselves over time with our time with the Lord sensitive to the Holy Spirit so that we respond in immediate moments with the Holy
Yep.
Spirit. When that happens, it helps to give clarity about how to address these things. But at the same time, find those who do bleed Jesus, right? And
Yep.
surround yourself with those people and begin to ask them the questions that you're asking yourself. Like, hey, do you guys feel like that everybody is I've got you around me because when I talk to you, Jesus comes off your lips. I know that you love the Lord. I see it, I hear it, I experience it when I'm around you. I'm encouraged being
Yeah.
around you. That's not everybody in our leadership. Is that a problem to you guys?
Yeah.
And I ask those questions, and then I ask for advice because they've been there for longer. Usually, if I'm new to the game,
Yep.
and I've inherited a leader, I will say though there will come a moment where you're trying to shift leadership, if you're a leader, to the way it should be, where there's going to be pushback, and people will see they're losing their grip if they like being in that leadership, and there will come
Yeah.
conflict. And I think
Yeah.
that what I have learned is that addressing conflict head on in humility, but standing on the word is the only way to address it rightly. And the longer
Yeah.
you wait to do that, the more stuff will get destroyed in the process,
Mm.
including people and relationships in the church potentially.
Yeah. That's one of those hard lessons to learn, but is so true. Uh, and that's probably one of the lessons I would say I've learned, just in life. So in ministry context and in other contexts, the longer you push off conflict, the worse it's going to be. And so one of the values is in addressing conflict early, and not letting it fester, because it's only going to cause problems when it festers. Um, I do want to draw out a couple of things I heard you say in the middle of all that. One of them gets at the idea of, if you recognize as the pastor that there is a skill you don't have and there's somebody in your world who does have it, bring them along. And so when you talk about your wife being able to have that kind of intuition, uh, for relationships and listening to the spirit and where the spirit's at work in someone, to invite that in for that additional level of discernment, there's huge value in that. At the same time, you have to be secure in who you are as the leader in order to be willing to do that. And so that maybe speaks to the personality issue that's hiding in there as well.
I would
Uh,
even pitch it a little differently if I could, Bill. I'd say
yeah,
I don't think you're wrong in the way you address that just then. I'd say I see it differently the way I see myself. I recognize how much sin in my own life hinders me, and I don't trust
mm,
myself as a leader by myself. I need
yep,
others around me who will say hard things and who will say the truth and who have the gifts that I don't have. And I think that together we're going to be more effective for the kingdom. And so I see it more of, you not only have to have the strength or confidence in self to do that. I think you have to have the humility. And I don't say I have
yes,
that, but I'm saying that's a huge component of that. You need to have the humility to recognize you really shouldn't think that you've got all that you need to do this job. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yep. No, I 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
And so being able to have that humility and recognize, and that really ties into the other half of what it is building If I use John Maxwell's words in terms of leadership, you build your inner circle, and that's exactly what you're getting at. Is you build out those people who are around you, which maybe don't include some of those people who've been in leadership positions that aren't bleeding Jesus, to use your
Yeah.
words.
Yeah.
But as you find those other people who do, that you can bring them along, and they can be the ones that are closest to you.
Yeah.
Kind of like Jesus ministered to everybody, but he had a group of 12 that he was tightest with. Right? I mean, that kind of idea of not only who's feeding into you, but who you also have a chance to feed into.
And
Right?
I'll say this too. I think if there's not a character issue, but there's like on the next lower down from that would be alignment issue to me.
Mm,
I have included people in that inner circle that aren't aligned with me because I hope that they're going to come on board, or I hope they're going to see where we're headed and decide to exit early instead
yeah.
of exiting later if they're going to do that. Because people will exit when new people come and new ideas, new vision, people exit. That's just what
Yeah.
happens. If there's not a character issue, but there's an alignment issue, I won't prohibit people from the inner circle because of alignment, because my goal is to create vision alignment and create
Right.
ministry alignment, right? So I want to be careful to make sure that if I see a character issue, they can't be on the inner circle. If I see somebody there that's just alignment issues theologically, if it's not severe, if it's not outside of
Yeah.
orthodoxy,
Right.
or if it's ministry alignment, or if it's vision alignment, those things we can work together on, and I think they'll catch the vision as we go. I've had that where somebody was going to be on the team because they were an influencer, they didn't have a competency or character issue. We brought them in, and they exited within like a month because they realized where we're headed is not where they wanted to be, and that's
Yeah.
okay. We parted in good terms.
Yeah.
I
Part
think
part of
that's what.
what goes along with that too, and with the idea of having those multiple voices who aren't all the same voice,
Yep.
uh, it it goes back to the notion of humility. As I think about it, it's also an opportunity to recognize I might not be the one through whom God's going to speak the vision that the direction that we're supposed to take next. And if
Yep.
you have a group of people who's all seeing things exactly the same way, just there's an overabundance of like-mindedness instead
Yeah.
of Christ-mindedness.
Yeah.
When you have that diversity that's in there, and you have the humility to recognize, okay, so I was very convinced that this is the direction we need to go, but I've got 7 people around me and 5 of them are saying something different, and they're all saying the same thing. Now I need to revisit and think,
Yep.
are they seeing something that I'm not seeing that I need to? And
Yeah.
it just fills out calling for the church and the direction the church goes.
Yeah. I actually would add to that that the way that I help to combat, the way I help to make sure I don't just surround myself with like-minded people is I think about it with the offices of Christ idea, where
Hmm.
Christ in the shortest version of that is prophet, priest, and king, right?
Okay.
The prophet guy is the guy that's black and white, scripture teacher, kind of vision guy, usually. Priestly would be the guy that's always concerned about the people. They keep asking, well, what about the people? What about the folks?
Yep.
And then you have the kingly person who's going to be all about the administration, the setup. How does this actually work? And how do we get from A to B? And so if you make sure you have a good rounding of those people, those types in your group, you're
Yeah.
always going to have that push pull where I think you're going to be more well rounded as a team. You're going to have various perspectives because you can't be all black and white prophet. Like, man, if they're going to leave, let them leave. And then not have, you have the priestly guy who's like, no, 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 we're supposed to love these people. Like
Yeah.
that's how you make sure you don't go off the rails. I think if you have only prophets and kings, you're going to have a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And so within that is also hiding so you have to know yourself. You have to know where you're strong, and you have
Self
to know where you're
awareness.
weak, and build out a team that caters to those efficiencies and deficiencies
Yep.
to build the best well-rounded team that you can build. And that's whether that doesn't matter what direction you're looking at. To an extent, you could be looking at an elder-driven church, you could be looking at a non-elder-driven church, you could be looking at a church with multiple staff members, you could be looking at a church where it's one staff member flying solo and he's bivocational. In any of those settings, you can build out your team of who is speaking into things and who is speaking into you and who you're speaking into
Yep.
in every single one of those settings.
Yep. 100%. Yeah, the other thing I would say, if we want to shift a little bit
Yeah.
after that leadership part, and I think you discern that again, time together with people, in depth discussions, willing to have hard conversations, and you want to think about things from like the bleeding Jesus, the character issues first,
Yeah.
and then alignment, chemistry, those kind of things. But the second part of that is that I would argue that as a pastor, I don't care in my perspective if it's established church, if it's a church plant, if it's revitalization, if it's already rolling well.
Mhm.
If the staff of your church are not working individually and corporately to make disciples, then I think we're
Mm.
off track. So there needs to be intentionality. There needs to be a response. They need to feel the responsibility to make disciples themselves. I don't mean by just preaching on Sunday morning. I
Yeah.
mean intentional personal development with for life transformation effect with individuals or small group of people. And they see the responsibility. They also have the desire to do it, even if they don't feel like that they're gifted that way. And they also need to actively be pursuing that. And so I think that either you look for that in people that are already doing it, that's the easiest. Um, but secondarily, you create accountability on your teams for that.
Mm.
And you also train them in how, don't assume they know how to do it. I mean, I don't know about you. I went to the same school you went to. I didn't leave my seminary
Yep.
feeling like I knew how to make a disciple, which is
Mm.
super sad. Okay. So I had all these theological training and all this knowledge input, but nobody showed me like, here's a path for how to bring somebody alongside you and help them grow into a mature disciple in a very direct, intentional way. I'm not saying there
Yeah.
wasn't push for that. Okay, I'm not saying the seminary is at fault. I'm saying I didn't leave there feeling like I was equipped to do that.
Yeah. So the word that's popping into my head right now in terms of thinking through the kind of disciple making you're talking about, it mentoring is the word that I'm thinking of, right? Coming alongside of some folks and helping them to see for themselves and grow for themselves in their walk. Is that fair? Is that fair to use the word mentoring there from what you're
I
thinking?
think I think mentoring in that capacity is good. I think that if we're not careful though, mentoring oftentimes can be used to take somebody from point A to point B, C, D in their own life, but it doesn't have necessarily inherently within it the idea of replication, of
Okay.
reproducing. And so I would say as long as that mentoring has in it, I think the three bases for this, and I love Dodson's book on gospel centered discipleship because he boils it down to three things. He calls them fight clubs originally, but it's just discipleship groups. Gospel centered discipleship is the name of the book.
Okay.
Um, he boils it down to three things. One, repenting of sin needs to take place in the context of community, confession and repentance.
Yep.
Okay. And rejoicing in Jesus. He's a pastor, so he alliterates the three R's rejoicing in Jesus and reproducing disciples. That all of us are on the mission. All of us need to get to the point where they grow. So you go from being dead spiritually to being an infant. This is not from him, but being an infant, learning how to walk, talk, breathe, eat, feed
Yep.
yourself, to being a child where you're self-focused, but you're growing, and become an adolescent where you're serving others, to then becoming a parent where you're reproducing, right? And so I think that process needs to be involved. As long as you add that process into the
Yeah.
mentoring aspect, then I would agree with you. Sorry for the long answer there, but
Yeah.
I think
No, but that's worthwhile, and that's a good uh, that's a good word. Um, so yeah, mentoring with the notion of there has to be replication. In other words, you're pouring into somebody else and helping them to grow, but in ways that they're going to be turning around and pouring into others as well.
yep.
Is what you're getting at. So
Making disciples who become disciple makers.
yep.
Yep.
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
Um, so yeah, as I reflect back on, I mean, this is a conversation I've had before, kind of. I've talked about this with other folks at different points throughout my, my ministry life since I moved away from Texas. But yeah, I would agree that there's a sense of I see the value in it, but I don't know that I learned how to do it well. And that's
Yep.
interesting because you and I, two different degree tracks, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
were in the track where you were doing a Master of Divinity degree. I was doing a master's in counseling, and then I ended up moving towards PhD work. Um, and probably the most I got of anything like this is in my PhD work in counseling.
Mhm.
I had an entire seminar that really focused in on supervision.
Yeah.
And so thinking about how do I pour into others, help them to learn the things they need to learn, to grow, to recognize and confront issues as they come up. Uh, that's some of what, but that's still only a piece. That's only
Yeah.
a piece of what you do when you're pouring into and edifying other people.
Yeah.
Edifying other people being, I think, a huge portion, which is, I mean, that's why I named the podcast "Speak Life," and just see the thorough need to build others up in the way
Yeah.
we deal with them.
Yeah.
and help them to grow. But you're right. I agree. I agree that the replication piece has to be in place to be doing it right.
Yeah, and I think the church in the last 50 years, and for good reason, I think has shifted to becoming a teaching center. But what the church needs to do is go back to Jesus's ways of being a training center. Like what's our purpose as pastors? To equip the saints for the work of ministry.
Yep.
My job's not to preach. My job's not just to pray. Those are the things that you see the apostles doing and saying, hey, send these guys over to care for these tables, these ladies that need help. But at the end of the day, what's the purpose? To make disciples who make disciples. And we need to train people. And so the church needs to think from the very beginning, how do we set up systems of training so that it's a pipeline of leadership development and that everybody needs to be in that pipeline? Like for our church plant, we don't have two stages, non-member, member. We have, you're on the mission, right? You are the mission. We're trying to reach you. Then you become a member. Then you become a multiplier. Then you become a missional leader.
Okay.
So we have 4 stages. So you don't just join the church and think I'm in, no.
Got my fire insurance. I'm in. Yep.
Yeah, right. So two quick anecdotal stories. I'll tell you that I was in a church for a long time when I was in seminary, where an older lady finally, we're doing testimonies on Sunday mornings in this country church outside of Fort Worth. And this lady stood up and goes, for 40 years, I've been in this church. And I finally realized it's not about me. It's not about me, and the question I asked preceding that was, can you be a mature Christian if you've been in the church 40 years, 20 years, 10 years, but you've never made a disciple when Jesus spent the entirety of his ministry making disciples and preaching the gospel? And that question was like, can we call ourselves like Jesus if we're not making disciples? And most of us have, in the church as a whole, just have never made a disciple individually. Yeah. So I think you'd find somebody doing it and you tag them and you ask, can I follow you around? Can I do it with you? And people be intentional about it. I forgot the other story I was going to share with you, but it must not matter. But that anecdotal story really helped, I think, for seeing the need for that and trying to equip people for that and making it simple enough to jump in, but it has to be double clickable. We simplify everything so much and it's not simple. It's messy and it's hard and it's holistic.
Yeah. So you described a little bit about how you do that in your church plant. I guess part of what I'm thinking is, how is that done? I'm thinking of that bivocational pastor again, who's flying solo at a church of 40 people. We were talking earlier about, looking for the 10, 20 families. What if they've got 2 families and their in-laws at their small church? How do you get some of this going? How do you facilitate that?
So that brings up the story I forgot. I remember now. I asked the question to an older gentleman who had been at small churches and mega churches as a pastor and had become the SBC president for a while. An older guy, super good guy, man. And I just had him in a class, my doctoral studies class, one of my classes, and I said, "Hey, if you could go back and do 1 or 2 things different, what would you do?" And the first thing out of his mouth, no hesitation, I would have discipled more people individually. So he said I would have gotten them 2 people together, or 3 or 4, but at least 2, and I would have spent more time with them to disciple them to become disciple makers. So I don't think it matters if you're a mega church pastor or if you're a church of like 15 and there are 2 families. You find 2 people that you can meet with on a regular basis. I think weekly or bi-weekly. If it's monthly, it's really not often enough.
Yeah.
For an hour and a half, and you just pour what you've got into them and really ask them. We like to think everybody's going to line up on point 1. We're going to learn how to pray. We're going to learn how to read the Bible. But where's the Holy Spirit working in their heart? I don't know about you, but I took chemistry in school. I don't remember anything about it because I didn't care and there was no reason to learn it. But if the Holy Spirit's pressing on them to learn something, say, where do you need to learn? Where is God working in you, or an area you want to grow in? And then help them in that area. That idea of kind of coaching, people listen. And I heard a quote a long time ago that knowledge that you find yourself is always more powerful than knowledge just communicated to you. Okay. So when you discover something, it's real big. So lead people into discovery, and help them do that and let them find the answers and listen to them and just point them in the right directions. So I think that's helpful.
Are there any particular resources that you would suggest? Any particular resources you think this is really good stuff and people ought to be reading it?
Yeah, so for pastors, not even non-pastors, but it's a thicker book. It's a little more academic. I would say he's got several books out about this, but there's one in particular by a guy named Sidney Greidanus. I think that's how you say it. It's Greidanus. He's got a book called Preaching Christ from the Old Testament.
Hmm.
And he gives basically seven pathways to go from Old Testament to the gospel. And that it's kind of like a hermeneutics book in a sense, right? And
Okay.
he'll say like, here's the story, let's look at it, and he'll say, in this idea, number three doesn't even work, so we can't use this. So he's really good about showing you that you just can't just find Jesus everywhere, behind everything, in every way, and
Yeah.
not to over allegorize. And he's not perfect at what he does. I mean, we all would disagree about certain
Yeah.
things, but he has them like the same thing, preaching Jesus from Daniel, preaching Christ from Ecclesiastes, preaching Christ for several he has that are really good. That's a good book for learning how to do what I'm talking about when it comes to Jesus centeredness. And I think that's been indispensable for me for helping others. The other one is what I mentioned by Jonathan Dodson, which is gospel centered discipleship.
Okay.
And I don't agree with all things. Like I don't think the group has to like stop at 18 months, or that it has to be 3 or 4 people. I do a group right now that's young men all over Texas on a Zoom call on Monday nights
Hmm.
that I'm a part of, that may have 5 people in it. Sometimes we have 12 people in it, and it's still effective. So I think that you can fudge all the number stuff, but he gives a good system. And I think the
Yeah.
best part about it is the underlying strategy and purposes of the group and what they're trying to accomplish in his gospel centered discipleship book. So those two resources I think are really handy for folks.
Sounds good. Sounds good. I guess there's just one last question I have. I've heard you talk about pouring into others. Um, what do you see on the flip side of that? Others pouring into you.
Yeah. So I've seen it over the years change. Like when I was in Maryland with you, Randy Millwood, man, he poured
Oh
into
yeah.
me. And just the time. I mean, I went into like a coaching relationship with him where he was coaching me, and then just as like a mentor and as a brother, invaluable, man, changed my life.
Yeah.
I think wherever you are, find somebody. One of the biggest things I would say is that when I lived in Maryland, we were kind of on the frontier, it felt like up there. And
Hmm.
so all the churches in our group were really close. We're like sister churches, and we
Yep.
really tried to be together and help one another and meet together regularly, the leaders, and care for each other and encourage one another. I still get prayer texts, and I send prayer texts to guys from up there every Sunday morning. Okay. Like it's
Yep.
just, we're close. When I got to Alabama again, the walls were high around churches. But I found a group of guys that I could network with. I think the importance of networking with guys and finding some older pastors that you can learn from. One guy in particular named Dick Kane
Yep.
really became that for me at the last place where I was and mentored me. He was at a different denomination even, but really helped me through some things, and was just a brother, an older brother.
Yeah.
And so I think finding that wherever you go, like as soon as I hit the ground in Texas, in Dallas, I immediately began I would just show up at churches and walk in and knock on the door. Hey, can I meet with the lead pastor for a second? And just try to
Yeah.
find people to connect with, and develop a
Yep.
network. So I think that's key for what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we need to make sure we don't lose sight of. Yeah. We need to be pouring into others, but we need to be poured into as
Yep.
well.
Yep.
By somebody who's a little further down the road. So,
Yep.
Thomas, thank you so much. This has been a huge blessing today. And so, for all of those of you who are listening, we'll have another episode next week. Join us, and thank you for listening today. Take care.
Thanks, man.